Calvin Hooker Goddard, the father of ballistics, was a forensic scientist, Army officer, academic, researcher and a pioneer in forensic ballistics. He examined the bullet casings in the 1929 St. Valentine's Day massacre and showed that the guns used were not police-issued weapons, leading the investigators to conclude it was a mob hit. Goddard was born in Baltimore, Maryland. After graduating from the Boys Latin School of Maryland in 1907, he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1911 from the Johns Hopkins University and then earned a medical degree and graduated in 1915. Calvin Goddard brought professionalism, the use of the scientific method, and reliability to forensic firearm identification, at a time when charlatanism was rampant in this field. His testimony in 1923 in the Fry case and others paved the way for judicial acceptance of firearms identification. In 1925, Goddard wrote an article for Army Ordnance titled Forensic Ballistics, in which he described the use of the comparison microscope regarding firearms investigations. He is generally credited with the conception of the term forensic ballistics, though he later admitted it to be an inadequate name for the science. In April 1925, Major Goddard established the Bureau of Forensic Ballistics in New York City with C. E. Waite, Philip O. Gravel and John H. Fisher. The Bureau was formed to provide firearms identification services throughout America. Goddard researched, authored and spoke extensively on the subject of forensic ballistics and firearms identification, becoming the internationally renowned pioneer in forensic ballistics. The Bureau of Forensic Ballistics was the United States' first independent criminalistics laboratories, which Goddard headed, and where ballistics, fingerprinting, blood analysis and trace evidence were brought under one roof. Dr. Calvin Goddard was a pioneer in the field of ballistics research. He developed the science of identifying fired bullets and empty cartridge cases. He proved that no two guns were made exactly alike, that every weapon makes characteristic marks on a bullet and a cartridge shell. His work was helpful in the massacre investigation. Dr. Goddard proved that the Tommy guns confiscated from Fred Killer Burke's house had been used in the massacre. He showed that a bullet taken from a body of a murder victim can be identified as having been fired from a specific gun because of marks the gun has left on test bullets. The St. Valentine's Day massacre exceeded any gangland killings before or after the 14th of February, 1929, throwing the city into a frenzy of police activity, awakening the Chicago Crime Commission, and dismaying civic-minded businessmen who were tired of hearing their city called the world's gangster capital. The massacre remains officially unsolved, but the Standard account has it engineered by Capone's right-hand man, Machine Gun Jack McGurn, who supposedly tricked the Moran gang into assembling at 2122 North Clark Street, about 10:30 a.m. on the 14th of February, 1929. The Moran lieutenants were drinking coffee in their unheated garage, when they were interrupted by two men in police uniforms. Annoyed but not particularly worried at what they assumed would be a routine shakedown, they surrendered their weapons and were ordered to line up facing the north wall. Before a payoff could be discussed, 2 or 3 more men in expensive overcoats entered the garage and the Moran group was raked with 70 bullets from 2 Thompsons, plus a couple of shotgun blasts. The killers then handed their now empty guns to the men in uniform who marched them, as if arrested, back outside to a phony police car and sped off. Bugs Moran, the intended target, survived only because he arrived a few minutes late, saw the bogus police car, and retreated. Bert Massey, vice president of the Colgate-Palmolive Peat Company, had heard of a New York criminalist named Calvin Goddard who had tried to introduce the new science of forensic ballistics into the court case of Nicholas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, the self-described anarchists accused of a 1920 payroll robbery in South Braintree, Massachusetts. 2 years after that, the city of Chicago was too preoccupied with closing speakeasies and arresting the usual suspects to give much thought to science. or spending city funds on it, but Massey had been sufficiently impressed by Goddard's work that he enlisted support from Walter Olson, president of the Olson Rug Company, and they used their own funds to hire Goddard's services. He immediately left his private laboratories in New York in the hands of 2 colleagues and began setting up an even more elaborate lab in Chicago to work on the massacre, at Coroner Bunderson's suggestion, because the police themselves were still suspects. A scientific crime detection laboratories was soon established under the auspices of the Northwestern University Law School, between Chicago's famous water tower, a souvenir of the Great Chicago Fire, and the lacquer front. Goddard's was a full-service laboratories, patterned partly after a lab set up 5 years earlier by August Vollmer in California. Goddard employed a new split-image comparison microscope developed by Philip Gravel, which actually was a pair of microscopes linked to a single eyepiece and had 2 independently rotating posts instead of a mirror and plate arrangement that would normally hold a slide. Bullets mounted with wax on each post could be slowly turned until the nearly invisible striations perfectly matched up, or failed to match up. The bullets came from different guns. Goddard also used a helixometer, newly developed by John Fisher based on the medical cystoscope, which could optically examine the interior of a gun barrel for residue, confirm its caliber, and determine the pitch of the rifling. Rifling differed among manufacturers and usually was unique to a particular brand, model, and caliber. Similarly, each gun left marks on the primers and casings of their empty shells that were also unique to a single weapon, using slugs taken from the massacre victims, including 70 fired bullets of .45 automatic pistol caliber, many of them whole, the rest more or less fragmented, and 70 shell casings picked up off the floor. Goddard first spent many hours explaining the theory and practice of forensic comparison. Then he established to the satisfaction of the coroner's jury that 2.45 caliber Thompson submachine guns had been used. The following December, while lying low as Frederick Dane near the lakeside town of St. Joseph, Michigan, Fred Killer Burke panicked following a minor traffic accident and killed a policeman named Charles Scully. He escaped, but the Berrien County, Michigan, Sheriff's Department raided his house near St. Joseph, Michigan, and found an arsenal of ordnance that included 2 Thompson guns. These were delivered to Goddard's laboratories for examination. They turned out to be the weapons used in the massacre, and the man who possessed them, Frederick Dane, who turned out to be Fred Killer Burke, had beat it out of town. The New York police were aware of Goddard's new crime lab and sent bullets taken from the body of local gangster Frankie Yale, which were found to have come from one of the massacre guns. A second machine gun used on Yale had been left in the car abandoned in Brooklyn by the killers. Impressed by Goddard's work on the massacre case, Chicago business leaders on the coroner's jury decided to finance the establishment of a private crime laboratories in Chicago. It was headed by Goddard and located at Northwestern University. It was established as a private crime lab to keep it at arm's length from the Chicago Police Department, which was rife with corruption at that time. The crime lab expanded beyond Goddard's expertise in firearms identification to include lie detection, document examination, toxicological examinations, fingerprint identification, and photographic evidence. The lab even experimented with scopolamine, truth serum. The Chicago lab was the inspiration and model for the FBI crime lab established 2 years later.